Hey everybody, I'm Jared Reeser, and this is my blog, Observed Impulse. And today I'm going to talk about a post that's my hypothesis for why people gray and why some people go bald. Here the title is An Evolutionary Explanation for Hair Loss and Graying, Signaling De-escalation and Reduced Challenge. So this is actually a concept I came up with in around 2004, but only last week I made the time to kind of flesh it out. It's just a personal theory, but I hope you find it interesting. Let's jump right in. So why hair matters socially? Hair loss and graying may function, at least partly, as visible cues that signal appeasement, reduced challenge intent, and a shift in social role. In a dominance hierarchy, especially one shaped by male-male competition, there's constant pressure to determine who's an active rival and who's not. Cues that reduce ambiguity about competitive intent can lower the frequency of costly challenges and stabilize group dynamics. So why these traits, balding and graying, might reduce immediate sexual attractiveness in a tournament sense, they may increase social standing by marking the individual as a safer, more established elder, worthy of deference rather than aggression. And there's also a personal kind of anecdote I want to share that I think kind of drives this point forward. I often walk the streets late at night. And if I see a man from a distance, I always get a little concerned as I pass him. If he's bald or gray-haired, I immediately drop my guard because I'm less worried that he's going to attack me. Now, that may not be a rational deduction, and it may not always be correct, but it is a real and automatic shift in perceived threat. It happens before any conscious narrative. That kind of fast, pre-conscious update occurring in milliseconds is exactly what you'd expect if traits are participating in threat appraisal and dominance triage, not just in aesthetics. It's probably been this way for millions of years of human evolution. And so what I'm arguing is that balding or that gray hair is actually protecting him because it's making him less threatening, or her. So the fact that all major human populations, i.e. races and ethnic groups, gray and bald, strongly suggest that these capacities have existed for tens of thousands of years. And the comparisons with other animals that we'll discuss suggest that they've existed for tens of millions of years. So dominance hierarchies have a management problem. If every male must constantly prove himself against every other male, the group bleeds energy and incurs injuries and destabilization. Systems that reduce the need for repeated testing have an advantage. That can be achieved by ritualized displays, by stable rank relationships, by coalition enforcement, and by badges that clarify who is in what role. And this is why I use the term appeasement. In everyday language, appeasement sounds like weakness. In evolutionary terms, appeasement is often adaptive. It's the strategy of lowering the temperature of conflict when the expected costs of escalation exceed the expected benefits. So appeasement is not surrender, it's conflict management. Beginning in midlife, skeletal muscle mass and strength slowly erode. And over that same interval, people show visible graying and in many men, progressive hair thinning. Muscle loss is one of the most consequential components of declining competitive capacity. So in this framework, graying and balding are not merely incidental byproducts of aging, but potentially part of an evolved shift from striving and posturing towards roles that are more compatible with late life fitness, including provisioning, kin investment, and social mediation. So now we get into the comparative foundations, right? Looking at animals. And I think this is really where the evidence is fascinating. So the coat of fur is one of the most persistent and distant readable channels an animal has, and social systems in a variety of animals repeatedly exploit that fact. So we'll start with lions. Male lions are the canonical example. Mane size and darkness co-vary with physiological state, and other members of your species, conspecifics, respond to that variation. The point is not simply that the mane correlates with testosterone or correlates with age. The point is that the mane becomes a decision variable in a competitive system. So the darker the male's mane, the less the other males want to mess with him, and the more the females want to mate with him. And fascinatingly, after a male loses his harem, often his mane will lighten, and it may reduce in size, may become reduced in size, specifically because he doesn't want to provoke. So gorillas provide a different primate mechanism that's closer to a stable life history badge, and that's the silverback phenotype. The emergence of the gray saddle is a coarse but powerful classifier. It does not merely mark chronological age, it marks dominance. So it's very different, but it's using color or graying to make a point about dominance. Okay, so next we move to homodryas baboons. Adult males develop a conspicuous mane called a mantle, and this is a cape-like growth of long hair around the shoulders and upper body that younger males do not possess. A mantle functions like a public label. The more dominant males have larger mantles. So depending on the baboon in question, their mane will get bigger, they'll change colors, all as they negotiate the status hierarchy and this concept of access to females. Okay, so next we look at macaques. In macaques, especially with rhesus macaques, coat condition and hair loss are closely intertwined with social environment. And the coat becomes a visible readout of burden, compromise, and in many cases, rank-related stress. So they keep track of rank using baldness, in a sense. And you can see these guys, tons of hair, some guys who are patchy, and some guys who are clearly balding in a very human-like way. Okay, so another interesting phenomenon is in several primate species, infants have conspicuously different coloration from adults, and the leading functional interpretations are social. The infant coat elicits tolerance, reduces aggression, and recruits caregiving or interest from group members. So this little white coat keeps this guy safe and shows the other members of the group, the other males often, that it's not a it's not a rival. Here's a totally different species of monkey, and you see its babies are orange, bright orange. So this is actually a classic finding in many bird species called delayed plumage maturation. In many bird species, young males reach sexual capability while still wearing a duller, juvenile-like or female-like plumage. And these males are classified differently by older dominant males, which reduces harassment and costly fights during the breeding season. So they'll stay brown and then only turn black when they're ready to start fighting for females. And you see the same thing in orangutans. It's a little different. They develop these, they get bigger, they get stronger, a number of things change with their fur, but mostly you see giant cheek flaps. They get these huge cheek flaps. That means they're ready to fight. Okay, and interestingly enough, sometimes with these birds and with the primates as well, the less developed males can obtain sneaky or peripheral mating opportunities. And of course, I imagine that balding men or graying men might do that as well, all while avoiding being treated as a full status rival. Here you can see that in the bald eagle, it takes 5 years for him to develop his all white head feathers and his yellow beak. Ungulates, like the black buck, broaden the argument in a way that's directly relevant to the reduced challenge logic. In several polygynous systems where males mate with multiple females, dominant breeding males develop striking coloration or darkening, while subordinate males remain lighter and often look closer to females or juveniles. So dominant males can allocate aggression efficiently, and peripheral males can remain near the group without constantly triggering maximal aggression. And me, as I'm graying, I imagine myself in a forager group, and I don't think I would trigger as much aggression from the rowdier younger males because of my personal balding and graying. So you see similar things in wolves, You see similar things in domestic dogs. Premature muzzle graying and stress-linked coat deterioration show up repeatedly in anxious or chronically stressed dogs. So here's this little guy 6 years later, and he definitely looks different. Okay, finally, social rodents help demonstrate that coats can be entangled with dominance in a way that becomes visible and socially meaningful. So you see the same thing in rats and mice. And when you see things in rats and mice, you expect to see them in most mammals. So they do this, it's a function of age, but it's also a function of stress, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So sometimes stress-linked coat changes create honest condition cues that shift how others respond. That's the design space in which human graying and androgenetic hair loss belong, in my opinion. They may be more than senescent noise, more than just aging. They may be part of a visible interface that helps regulate challenge behavior by shifting how receivers categorize the individual. So here is a table with some of the animals that we talked about. And here are some pictures. So this is that mantle that those baboons get, and they can lose them. Here's the same mouse before and after. Lions change a lot. Dogs gray. Gorillas turn into silverbacks, and rhesus monkeys lose a lot of fur. So it's not just monkeys and dogs, but chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans all show some degree of hair graying with age, which is exactly what you would expect if pigment loss in hair is an evolutionarily ancient feature of primate biology rather than a quirky human invention. So coming back to hamadryas baboons, a specific type of baboon gives a rare example where a conspicuous silver phenotype is not just an age byproduct, but appears to track reproductive position. So adult males develop the pale, grayish mantle that makes a harem-holding male visually legible at a distance. And descriptions from the primatology tradition note that when a male loses his unit and declines, his appearance can partially shift back toward a more brown, female-like coat. I mean, come on, guys. That's pretty fascinating, and I think relevant to the argument here. So coloring really has a lot to do with dominance. And primates, a number of primates, and we are primates. Okay, so very different but similar in some ways. Male Galata baboons have a conspicuous red chest patch that tracks dominance in mating access. When a male becomes a leader, male with females, the patch becomes redder and more saturated, and after takeovers, males who lose leadership and reproductive access show a reduction in redness. Then in several monkeys, including mandrills, dominance and androgenic conditions are written onto the face or rump in a way that can strengthen or fade with social position. In vervets and several macaques, they have male genital coloration, which change. So these examples make the human changes seem normal and pale by comparison. So here's a bunch of other changes which are visible signals involving fur, skin, or structures in primates, many of which we didn't talk about. So there's some other interesting things that seem related. Let me mention them really quick. Across many herbivorous mammals, you see a basic design solution show up again and again. A normally muted animal carries a high contrast flash mark that it can reveal and move when being pursued by predators. So white-tailed deer are the classic example. Rabbits and hares do something similar. Many antelope and gazelles do this. And pronghorns do this. It's essentially amplifying an "I see you" message to the predator, telling it that it probably wouldn't benefit the predator waste energy chasing it because the pronghorn or the bunny is faster, and it's saying, you missed me this time. Specialists also think that it could be sending a message to their companions, saying, hey, let's get out of here. We should move. So you see this. So this involves white coloration, and again, it's a signal to other animals. And I think that even the common rooster offers a relatively clean, intuitive example. The comb and wattles on the rooster's head enlarge dramatically as males approach sexual maturity, and this tracks the rise of androgenic and reproductive physiology in the way secondary sexual traits typically do. Comb size is larger in higher-ranking males and can be reduced in response to season, stress, and social pressures. And just like the hair on the top of our head, these are conspicuous traits right around the eyes that change. So now we're specifically going to get into the concept of stress. So it's not just aging in these animals and changes in dominance, but also stress, which is involves adrenaline, cortisol, stress hormones. And these are very reliable findings. So one of the most robust ideas in signaling theory is that the body often externalizes information about a burden in ways that are difficult to falsify. When an organism is under chronic strain, the phenotype changes, not always in a single uniform way, but in a way that's detectable. Hair and coat condition are among the most visible places where this detectability emerges. So systems that read condition quickly avoid many unnecessary escalations. We talked about that. So stress affects the coat, and that compromise is public. It can shape how others approach, avoid, affiliate with, or target the individual. In other words, primate coat deterioration is an honest condition cue precisely because it's expensive and difficult to prevent under high strain. And you can kind of see an example of what happens at the hair follicle. But the stress system has a very direct mechanism for turning hair gray, and also for hair loss as well. And why would that exist? The idea is, why would that exist in all these mammals if it was purely pathological? I think it's pretty clear that it's a signal. So this means that the receiver does not have to infer this is stress versus this is age with perfect precision. What I'm trying to say is that the hair graying and hair loss with stress, it looks like age, right? It's kind of, in a way, it's mimicking an older individual. So the receiver of the signal only needs to treat the phenotype as a probabilistic cue of reduced robustness or competitive mode. And humans have close analogs. So we all experience something called telogen effluvium, and this is when you've had a real bad week and you can see the hairs in the drain in the shower. So telogen effluvium is a stress-linked shedding response that can follow illness, psychological strain, or major physiological disruption. Premature graying is often genetic, but it's also accelerated by burden. And it's commonly pointed out that presidents can go gray or gray a lot during their tenure. So this is the sense in which stress can borrow the visual language of aging. As an additional note, I'd like to add that I've had my nose and parts of my skull broken in my late teenage years. And after this accident, I immediately started losing copious amounts of hair on my head. I believe my body assumed that the injury was a major status defeat caused by a rival group member, and that it would be in my best interest to advertise this, because if it happened again, it could kill me. Relatedly, my mother ruptured a disc in her lumbar spine in her 30s and immediately acquired a shock of white hair above her forehead. She also told me recently that she's experienced hair loss due to stress caused by an ongoing business circumstances that I believe her body interpreted as intragroup hostility. In other words, hair loss and graying in response to stress appears to be an evolved defense that's now misplaced in our modern environment. So here are different human hair traits and their meanings. Okay, and we're going to talk about the human phenotype, hair loss and graying as appeasement cues. So in humans, graying and hair loss are unusually salient because they're visible at long range and are difficult to conceal in ancestral contexts. There are no wigs or hair dye in the wild, and hair loss and gray hair are not subtle. They announce life stage. They also carry a strong social valence. Today we treat them as meaningful, which is already a cue that they may have been meaningful for a long time. The core proposal is that these traits function, at least partly, as appeasement cues and reduced challenge cues. They bias receivers towards seeing the individual as older, more senior, less likely to escalate physical conflict, and less likely to engage in direct tournament-style competition for mates. This does not require that the traits are flattering. Signals can be costly. Signals can reduce attractiveness. The question is whether they also reduce conflict, reduce challenge frequency, or shift the individual into a safer social niche. Another interesting consideration, which I'll talk more about at the end, is I think it's possible that hair loss and gray hair may communicate that the individual is older, respected, valuable, and has alliances. Clearly, the individual has made it this far. So this is kind of more like the gorilla take, right? They've avoided death from predators and rivals, so it's not only that this older person is trying to appease the younger people, but they're making a statement saying that they've proven that they're a survivor and are valuable to a group, so don't worry about them trying to assault you, but also don't mess with them because it's not going to help you. Okay, so in a dominance hierarchy, gray hair can reduce the probability that others view you as a rival who is actively seeking escalation. It can also signal that you have moved into a different social role, more aligned with mentoring, coalition building, kin investment, or leadership through legitimacy rather than raw physical challenge. That does not mean the individual is non-sexual or non-competitive. It means the social system can reinterpret them. So hair and pigmentation are comparatively cheap to modify, and they're perpetually on display. They're also closely linked to endocrine state and life history timing. So it's not a huge change that the body's making. It's a pretty cheap one. Okay, so then we start to ask, so was there really all this pressure on us evolutionarily through time to develop these adaptations? And to get an idea, we look at hunter-gatherers, right? So in many small-scale forager and hunter-gatherer societies, within-group violence is not rare, and it's often structured around the mating economy rather than random disputes. Ethnographic tallies from multiple populations suggest that a non-trivial fraction of homicides are tied to romantic rivalry, adultery, marital conflict, jealousy, and competition over women's attention, and the victims and perpetrators are disproportionately male. In some groups, violence accounts for a striking share of mortality, and it's concentrated in the very demographic window that is most engaged in status contests and reproductive tournament behavior, namely young to middle-aged men. So this is the share of deaths in foraging groups attributable to homicide and warfare. So this includes natural deaths, right? So this means that here with the Maya-Enga, 18.6% of their deaths are violent deaths. Many of those are male fighting within a group, and often it involves women. So we're looking at these numbers, 39, 18, 6, 20, pretty large when you compare them to the number in US and Europe from 1900 to 1960 here, which is less than 1%, right? It's a fraction of a percent. So we don't know really what it was like back in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. It seems like it was pretty tough. And things like balding and signaling with gray hair really could have helped people escape this kind of violence. Okay, and then here we look at proximate causes of hair changes. I didn't get into these too much, but it talks more about endocrine and cellular processes involved. These are Aboriginal Australian practices of coloring hair. There are Aboriginal Australian practices of coloring hair and beards with ochre in ceremonial contexts. And in some cases, this is explicitly associated with senior men or high-status individuals. Okay, so any good hypothesis should make predictions, right? The first prediction that we can make is perceptual. So if these traits, balding and graying, are part of a threat prior system, then they should shift judgments quickly and reliably. In experiments, people should rate gray-haired and naturally balding men as less likely to initiate aggression than otherwise matched men with youthful hair cues. I certainly do. Okay, a second prediction is behavioral. If hair cues reduce challenge, they should influence approach distance, vigilance, and deference behaviors. So in naturalistic studies, people should maintain less defensive distance around older appearing hair phenotypes compared to younger appearing phenotypes, holding other variables constant. In controlled lab tasks, participants should show reduced physiological arousal, reduced startle potentiation, or reduced defensive responses when exposed to bald or gray cues. Third, in groups where male-male competition is salient, natural balding and gray-haired men should receive fewer direct challenges from age-matched peers. They may receive more default deference in some contexts, or at least more benign neglect, the social equivalent of not being picked for the fight. These effects will be context-dependent. In competitive mating contexts, they might reduce perceived rivalry. In leadership contexts, they might enhance perceived legitimacy. So a couple more points. If these visible hair traits were merely the result of cumulative cellular damage or entropy, we would expect them to manifest indiscriminately. Instead, we find highly conserved specific molecular pathways that actively drive these changes in response to internal states. The most striking evidence for a signaling function comes from the biology of graying. We now know that the sympathetic nervous system has a direct wired connection to the hair follicle. During the fight or flight response, the release of noradrenaline causes melanocyte stem cells to differentiate rapidly and migrate out of their storage niche. This is not a passive failure of the pigmentation machinery. It is an active liquidation of the pigment reservoir. The body essentially uses a specific neural pathway to permanently encode stress history onto the surface of the organism. The argument for an evolved design is even stronger when we consider the molecular paradox of androgenetic alopecia, which is male pattern baldness. If balding were simply a toxic side effect of male hormones, we would expect androgens to inhibit hair growth systemically. Yet we see a precise tissue-specific inversion. In the beard and on the chest, dihydrotestosterone promotes hair growth via IGF-1 signaling, serving as a classic marker of virility. On the scalp, however, the exact same hormone triggers TGF-beta to miniaturize the follicle and arrest growth. Evolution has maintained two diametrically opposed signaling pathways for the same hormone in adjacent tissues. This specificity suggests that the male phenotype is being actively remodeled rather than passively degraded. The endocrine system appears programmed to simultaneously sculpt a signal of masculinity on the jawline and a signal of seniority and reduced threat on the crown. So we're nearing the end here. Here's some other evolutionary hypotheses related to balding and graying. That it's a byproduct of aging, that it's a pure health condition, that it's involved in sexual selection for attractiveness, that it's involved in thermoregulation or keeping you warm, ectoparasite hygiene, social appeasement and reduced challenge, that's the present hypothesis, or the opposite, social domination or intimidation. And here are some cues of aging, other cues of aging in humans that could be used. Posture and gait, musculature, voice, facial morphology, injury and condition markers. So even if the present hypothesis ends up being wrong or only partly correct, it encourages a different kind of question. Instead of asking only, what is breaking, it invites us to ask, what social work might this change be doing, and how is it being interpreted by the group? In many primates and in humans, late life can represent a role transition rather than a collapse. One can exit the most volatile arena of reproductive tournament behavior and move into a different social niche, one that's often more stable and arguably more valuable to kin. Elders can become repositories of social knowledge, conflict moderators, and caregivers. Grandparents can convert experience into protection and provisioning, and they can amplify the success of descendants even when they're not competing for mates directly. If hair graying and hair loss reduce challenge pressure and signal a lower rival profile, that would not be a signal of worthlessness. It would be a signal of role shift, away from ridiculous status games and petty sexual dynamics. It could also be a way to remain safely inside the group while reorienting from mate competition toward kin investment and social stewardship. So in many social systems, the most conflict-intensive phase is not youth or old age, but the long middle stretch where individuals are still posturing, crowing, headbutting, striving, and actively trying to define themselves as they work their way up the social hierarchy ladder. That is the phase where males are most likely to be treated as immediate rivals, where coalition churn is high and where status tests are frequent. A visible shift in hair phenotype can act like a kind of graduation marker, an honest signal that the individual is no longer in the audition phase of life. It's a public credentialing cue that says, in effect, this person has already cemented their place or status in the group. They're not immaturely trying to steal mates, not trying to dominate every room, and not trying to escalate every interaction into a tournament. Instead of risking their life to increase their reproductive success and have more offspring, they want to remove that risk and focus on the offspring they may already have. So if this interpretation is correct, the prediction is not just that gray hair and natural balding reduce perceived threat, it's that they bias receivers toward a different category assignment altogether. Less rival, more senior, more credible, more suited to counsel and mediate, and therefore less worth challenging. So here are the references. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching. Let me go ahead and plug this other related evolutionary theory that I wrote up on ED. So ED is a lot like menopause in women. And there's a very strong hypothesis that's widely accepted in the literature about why women go through menopause. So why would women want to stop having babies? They can no longer increase their reproductive success by having children, right? Well, the reason is that older women are much more likely to die during childbirth. And at a certain age, at a certain point, it's not worth it for the mom to continue to do that. But how would evolution naturally select a woman to continue to live and to stop having kids? And the reason is that they can increase the reproductive success through their children, right? Of their children. And the argument here is pretty similar. It's similar to a lot of what we just talked about as well. And it basically says that that ED is a context-sensitive strategy rather than a uniform pathology. So I thought you might find that interesting too. I'm going to go ahead and link both articles in the description of this video. Thanks again for listening, guys.